Welcome to Classes in Session, presented by UI Health. I'm Doug Glanville. The art of negotiation is central to how the business of sport is constructed. Over time, through debate and sometimes outright hostility, sports have been shaped by those at the table working to get the deal done. This has led to everything from free agency to the number of players on a roster. Many sports have players' associations that represent the collective, which take the pulse of the players to then forge new understandings through negotiation. Yet it takes remarkable skill and patience to find that space in the middle, to accept that compromise is needed and that no matter how long the strike lasts or how tough the locks are on the lockout, there will be two sides to the story. One is player-driven, the other comes from the institutions, leagues, and owners. But there are fans in the middle as well. And today we will consider what goes into negotiating all the deals that comprise the world of sports. And we have two excellent guests to help us understand it. Evan Drellich, senior Major League Baseball writer at The Athletic, who covered the negotiations for the newest MLB collective bargaining agreement from beginning to end. And Jeffrey Kessler, renowned attorney who has spent over 4 decades working on antitrust law to guide a number of unions and associations. Let's get to class. The ability to negotiate is at the economic heart of any business. In sports, this is important both on the field and in the boardroom. Deals need to be made to create institutional understandings between everything and everyone that makes an organization function. Negotiation comes into play throughout the entire spectrum of operations, from stadium financing to television contracts to player value. The skill at making deals establishes worth as well as rights. Every professional sport has legal structures by which they operate. Collective bargaining agreements are negotiations between players and ownership to determine the terms of employment. Yet there are other ways leagues can memorialize their relationships. For example, Olympic athletes are not employees, but they still have terms by which they are supported as well as how they represent their nation. The negotiations that capture fan imagination arise from watching a star player consider where to play next. A watershed moment was when LeBron James announced his decision to play for the Miami Heat with a cast of other star teammates joining him. Worth noting is the system that allowed him to even have a choice. It came from labor negotiations to establish free agency. This showcased the tug of war that reflects the power of athletes when they have the leverage of choice. Most athletes never reach this level of positioning, but they still can enjoy great success by producing on the field and having good representation to help extract the most value. This process is an art form. The better negotiators will gain favorable conditions for who they represent. This could be the difference between millions of dollars for a player and billions for an industry or franchise. Nothing has drawn the public's attention around the constant tensions like Major League Baseball's negotiations. The structure of the game has flowed through frequent work stoppages until finally hitting a 25-plus year period of labor peace. But even in peace, they have had to sit across the table and hammer out the details. This is the nature of dealing in league contracts. There is a pool that is shared between the parties, and they must determine how to divide it up. They also must set how their sport will be played, which can impact anything from the distance of the three-point line to the use of tech to enhance officiating to whether a shifting defense is allowed. All of these elements can be traded for another element until the paper is finally signed. Then it must be played out. Negotiation skills shape so much in our world. Sports are just one picture of it, but whether it leads to peace accords or how a school district will finance a new high school, people must find a way to reach an agreement or the system collapses. So those working the deal matter significantly. They must follow the rules of engagement, follow the law, and often to win the deal, follow the money. Very excited for our next guest, Evan Drellich, who is an author of a forthcoming sign-stealing scandal book on the Houston Astros, senior baseball writer with The Athletic, and really interesting, covered the labor beat around Major League Baseball's negotiations for their new collective bargaining agreement. So Evan, welcome to Classes in Session.
I'm just recovering now from those labor negotiations, Doug. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, so today we're talking about the art of negotiation. And I mean, you had a front row seat to this between Major League Baseball and the Players Association. So I guess on a big picture, I'm curious about what stood out about sort of the negotiations sort of in a general way with this as what you saw with the collective bargaining work.
Well, from a coverage perspective, I think it's as close to being involved with politics as you're going to find in sports. I don't think it's identical to covering politics. I think it's different than most other reporting you find in baseball. Certainly agents will try to drum up markets for players. It's not that there aren't times when people are trying to leverage you as a reporter, but my filter had to be very high while covering this.
Well, so within this, did you discern a strategy as to why they were, kind of working certain avenues towards the press? Was there an approach to this?
Absolutely. I mean, look, at the end of the negotiations, if you recall, and even in kind of the week or so prior, if you go back to that night, there was a night that they were talking for about 16 and a half hours in Florida. And you could see the excitement starting to build. And just as an example, when you have a situation where one side is trying to get more out of another side, so that was the players trying to get more out of management here, presumably the earlier offers are not going to be ones that fully achieve that goal or come close to it for the players. So it would probably be to management's benefit to get an offer accepted by the players as soon as possible, right? The quicker the deal, the better it would have been for the owners.
Well, and you mentioned fairness. And what I found fascinating is trying to negotiate kind of a moral code, right, or something ethical, whether it's, all right, we want to stop tanking, we want to have competitive balance, things that sort of have a moral fiber to them, but you're also in the room talking about core economics. So what did you find in the negotiations about how to reconcile talking almost two different languages around terms or what are important to each side?
Yeah, I in my coverage I believe there was never a moment where I said XYZ should or should not happen. Certainly the players built their case around this notion of fairness, and both sides can value any move in the collective bargaining agreement. But at the end of the day, it's not about fairness. And I did try to write that at different points and make that clear that, you can sit there and go, well, Jimmy got more crayons than Susie, and so now Susie deserves to get her crayons back. But that's not how it works in labor negotiations. The only thing that matters at the end of the day is what you're willing to fight for. The players could be offered the best deal in the world. They could be offered the worst deal in the world. The only thing that determines what actually happens is whether they are willing to sign a deal and show up for work. And it goes in the other direction as well. The owners could have the sweetest deal overall. And if they still want more, well, they have a choice. They can say, you know what, we're not agreeing to a deal, and we're not going to start games back up until you give us more. So fairness is this kind of nice, sweet, idealistic backdrop, but it doesn't actually end up swaying the negotiation. What sways the negotiation is what either side is willing to fight for.
We continue with Evan Drellich as we dive deeper into baseball labor negotiations, and then we're joined by famed labor attorney Jeffrey Kessler next on Classes in Session with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health. Welcome back to Classes in Session with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health, as we continue with the Athletic's Evan Drellich. When you have recently written about the outcome, you described it as kind of a win for the players, like this particular negotiation, especially relative to their last deal. What did you think was successful from the player side, where they were uniquely effective in these negotiations?
Yeah, there's another perspective where it's a win, which was something I was talking about with people the night it ended, which is that if you look at the work stoppages in the other men's sports, the other major men's sports, basketball, football, and hockey, they've all been lockouts since 95, right? Since the baseball strike in 95, baseball hasn't had a work stoppage. Every other sport has had lockouts. Those lockouts were all about the owners trying to get something from the players. This lockout, yes, the owners always have to start a lockout, but everybody knew for years that this CBA was going to be about the players getting something from the owners. So by virtue of the fact that the players did make gains here, right? They got more money in the luxury tax. They got this new pre-arbitration bonus pool. They got minimum salaries up. These are changes that you look at and go, okay, this moves at least a little bit in the players' direction. That just hasn't happened in the other sports. Every other time, it's been the owner's trying to get something. And so the fact that the players got something here relative to other sports is notable.
Well, and what of the devastation of missing games or the threat of it? How much did you think it played into the way they negotiated in terms of, that concern about what would happen to the games and the fans?
Well, if you just look at when the numbers finally moved in the negotiation, it waited till the end, and it was pretty drastic. They were talking about the league was proposing a $10 million bonus pool, a $15 million bonus pool, and then it starts to creep up, and then you wake up and all of a sudden, now it's at 50. And so certainly if I cover another one of these, and who knows if I will, but if I do, I'm going to remember not how little everything means before the final couple weeks, but yeah, the final couple weeks really were where the movement came, and that was expressed to me, and I reported it, but it still kind of hits you differently once you really see it up close. That this is always true.
Well, I've been just thinking ahead, looking ahead. Now that you know what you know and covering this so closely in the modern day, what do you think's next if you look to the next agreement, the next set of issues?
I guess the question for the next negotiation would be, do the players end up the messaging and the clear discussion around this one was players want to make gains. Is that the exact same thing in the next one? Or do we hear more from ownership side to something even start visibly to work against owners such that there's more of a competing, no, we need to change this in our favor as the owners? Or is it part two, or is it a different conversation? I would imagine it's part two. It's the players continuing to try to reclaim and claw back some things, but let's see what the next 3 years, 4 years brings. I have no idea.
Well, Evan, really, I want to thank you for taking the time. Always enlightening, and that's what we shoot for here in Classes in Session, just sort of teaching.
Thank you, Doug. Appreciate it.
Thankful to be joined by Jeffrey Kessler, a renowned attorney with decades of experience around antitrust labor issues. He's worked with athlete empowerment, equal pay, and he currently is at Winston & Strawn as an international attorney working on litigation and other issues around labor. Thank you for joining us there, Jeff.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Well, today our topic is around the art of negotiation, and you've seen this so directly and so much in our sweet spot around sports. And so I just wanted to start just at a basic question of, through the spectrum of experience, what have been some of the key takeaways about what you've learned about negotiating and getting things done?
So there are many lessons that I think I've learned over the years. I think the most important lesson is that you really have to gain an understanding of what your counterparty is looking for and what their goals are and how those are going to conflict with your goals, and also get a keen understanding of leverage, which is who has the negotiating power to achieve their goals and what steps can be taken to increase your leverage if you need more. And finally, how to achieve something which both sides can, in the end, walk away from feeling at least satisfied with. Because if you try to engage in bargaining, where one side is expected to totally kill the other side, you're going to have a very painful, expensive, and difficult experience. And if you ever have to do business with that side again, it's not going to be conducive to future relations.
Often the money on the table is such a big factor, but you have worked very diligently around a lot of ethical, moral questions, whether you're trying to create policy around domestic violence or COVID policies. Is there a difference negotiating-wise strategically when you're approaching issues that raise ethical and moral concerns versus, say, I just want to have a salary cap?
Well, my clients would say yes, and I have to agree with that, because some principles that are morally based are not negotiable. In our equal pay case, for example, we were not going to settle, the women were not going to settle for anything less than equal pay going forward. There's no such thing as half equal or compromise equal. There is equal. That was a principle. It could not be compromised. Dollars can be compromised. You can compromise money. You can't compromise principle.
And in many of those cases that you describe in that framework, they set precedent. They set precedent. So is there a critical thing we should understand about what your concerns are as a negotiator when you're literally setting precedent? I mean, Freeman McNeil and free agency in the NFL, Oscar Robertson, NBA. I mean, these are cases you've worked on where literally the entire structure is going to change and many will be impacted even beyond that sport. Is that change your calculus in any way around how you negotiate?
Yes, well, it goes again to what's acceptable. In the Freeman McNeil case, the players took that case all the way through a trial and won a trial. They then filed another litigation called the Reggie White litigation because they still had not achieved everything they needed to achieve. And it was only when the NFL was finally willing to agree to unrestricted free agency as part of the settlement going forward that a deal could be made, because they were determined that was going to be the objective. There were many opportunities to settle for less. And the players said, no, we're not going to do that. And they were led by the great Gene Upshaw at the time. And Gene used to say, don't be afraid to win. And what he meant by that is that sometimes you have to go all the way and go for that victory.
We'll be right back on Classes in Session with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health, as we continue our conversation with Jeffrey Kessler. Welcome back to Classes in Session with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health, and we pick up the discussion with Jeffrey Kessler. Well, that brings me to this thought about the sport that I was involved in and still am with Major League Baseball. Is there something that your insights allow you to see about what people perceive to be such a contentious dynamic and relationship that's sort of behind the curtain?
Sometimes what you read in the press, in fact, often what you read in the press about what's going on at the meetings and the level of contentiousness as things is not always accurate. Different parties have different reasons for leaking different things, which they think it will achieve some objective for them in negotiating or getting messages to the other side. So I wouldn't assume whether it's baseball, football, basketball, hockey, whatever it is, that you're necessarily getting the true picture. The second thing I would say is that negotiating with sports leagues is especially difficult for unions in all sports because the owners frequently have different issues among themselves between the high revenue teams and the low revenue teams. And what happens is that the owners in these different sports tend to negotiate among themselves and agree on a position and go, okay, that's the position. But then they don't realize that that's not going to be an acceptable position to the players, and they get frozen in the bargaining. And sometimes the bargaining becomes very difficult there. In that situation, the personality and capability of the commissioner can have a great influence. The ability of that commissioner to sort of forge leadership on his or her side, as opposed to just sort of, relaying the views of these very divided, and contentious ownership groups.
What have you found to be the most effective types of leadership when it comes to what you've seen in sports and labor that allow you to be in that space where you are getting along, or at least you are reaching positive outcomes and even publicly displaying that?
From the standpoint of union leadership, you need a leader who's very much in touch with their membership and what their membership wants and keeps them informed and communicates with them. You have to deal with star players and journeyman players and mid-level players. And so, you really need great communication skills on the owner side. I think what you most benefit from is a commissioner who is willing to stand up to his or her owners and lead them, as opposed to someone who is just, being the the representative of the owners, just as the mouthpiece for the owners, because just like the player side needs leadership, the owner side needs strong leadership.
Well, I want to address maybe the mythology of negotiations, because we always hear this win-win. Can you put some real legal teeth behind it and what you think it means, and is it really achievable?
Yes, absolutely. If both sides are realistically assessing the interest of each other and the respective leverage that each side has, win-win deals are often possible. I could give you an example of that. The 2016 deal in the NBA was a win-win deal that was achieved early with little acrimony, no legal fights, because both sides recognized there was a huge revenue infusion coming into the league as a result of dramatic increase in broadcasting revenues. And that made it possible to agree upon something for which both sides could substantially benefit, as long as neither side was determined, and being unreasonable and trying to force a loss on the other side.
The art of negotiation is truly an art. More than just finding the numbers that split the difference, there is a soul of understanding that allows deals to get done with minimal damage to the game and to the public's support. It is important that those at the table know that they must approach everything so that the sport lives to fight another day. That all-out destruction of the values of those across the table lead to irreparable damage, making any victory a Pyrrhic one. Inside these negotiations are values, some of which are non-negotiable, that equal pay means equal and any compromise short of full equality is not acceptable. Yet it is a process that involves steps, and there is an opportunity to leave breadcrumbs for the future so those that come next can find a way to reach that final goal. Sports inspire us through its lessons in teamwork, fair play, and equal rules for all. But through history, those sports also inform us in the courtroom and in places where policy is made. It yields outcomes that will live beyond the field of play. I'll see you in class.